my name is Petra Nordqvist. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and I'm leading on a project about donation and how being an egg or sperm donor impacts on donors' own everyday lives and relationships. And we have done a major study over the last 3 years about donors, egg donors and sperm donors, and ID release donors in the UK, as well as known donors in the UK, and exploring really how being a donor impacts on donors' own lives, as well as the relationships in which they live, relationships with children, with their partners, with their grandparents, and so on. And the questions that came up of the event, from the event Known Unknowns, the pros, cons, and consequences of known donation. I'll answer the 2 questions. I'll read them and then I'll give an answer, and then I'll take number 2. So question number 1, do you think that the importance of genetics can sometimes undermine some family structures, particularly queer families, who may not use their own genetic material in terms of perceived legitimacy? I think this is a really important question, and one that sort of we should really think quite hard about, because I think it's actually quite a complex question to answer. And on the one hand, I think that the renewed emphasis on genetic links that has come with the ending of donor anonymity and so on, really feeds into some very traditional ideas about what families looks like and what a proper family look like, and that being the heterosexual genetic nuclear family with biological children. And I think it's a discourse, a sort of cultural understanding of what it means to be family that feeds sort of straight back into those ways of thinking about family life. So in some ways, it's a very traditional way of understanding what it means to be family, what it means to be parent, and what it means to be connected to one's children. And certainly research with lesbian couples, for example, has shown that they can very much feel at the kind of receiving end of those kinds of messages, that they are not, the queer families are not proper families, and the queer families are somehow not as legitimate because of this discourse around genetics. So, for example, they might feel that grandparents don't think of their children. The parents on the side of the non-birth mother who hasn't got a genetic link with her children may not feel connected. Those grandparents might not recognize themselves as grandparents or that child as their grandchild. The role of non-birth mothers, more broadly speaking, culturally speaking, is a very sort of culturally unknown, so it can be very difficult to claim. Equally, kind of constant questions about sort of fathers, and if something is missing in queer families, in same-sex families, can be very troublesome and undermining for queer families. But on the other hand, we mustn't also forget that same-sex couples themselves use these tropes and understandings of what it means to be related to build their own families. So when I've done research interviews with same-sex couples as well as their parents, they have often talked about the importance of family resemblances in their families, about choosing donors so that there will be a family resemblance between the child and the non-birth mother, for example. They talk about the importance of having the same donor for siblings so that the children will share a genetic connection, especially if the mothers take turns to give birth. So it's actually really complex. It's more complex, I think, than it might seem at first, because obviously same-sex couples who have children are also part of the same culture, which emphasizes genetic connectedness as ways of making family. So they are also part of making sense of their own families in this way. So question number 2 that has been put to me is, while the Curious Connections project showed that donors do not see themselves as parents, the media will say real mother or father when discussing their progenitor or donor. Will the removal of anonymity exacerbate this understanding of family life? So as the donor, as a real mother or the real father? This is another complicated question, and I'm going to give a complicated answer, I'm afraid to say. I think the removal of donor anonymity is not exactly the problem here. The problem is the much bigger culture in which these things operate. I think it's important to remember that donor anonymity, what came about in an era, not because genetic links or blood or DNA wasn't wasn't emphasized as part of family. In fact, it was so emphasized that to do anything, to have a family that didn't have these bonds was so stigmatized that people were encouraged to keep it a secret. So donor anonymity, it's really important, I think, to keep hold of that history, that actually it doesn't come out of not emphasizing genetic links. It comes out of a history where they're so emphasized, so stigmatized that they had to be kept secret. And I think in answering this question, the question is not so much about the problems of donor anonymity or whether that will exacerbate the idea of real motherhood and real fatherhood. What I think is the real issue here at play is a wider culture that emphasizes, that has a sort of normative understanding of parenthood as necessarily biological, as necessarily heterosexual. And it's a culture that really emphasizes this kind of biological connection as making proper parents, whilst downplaying social aspects of parenthood, the commitment of care and time to raising one's children. And I think that's where the issue lies, that we have a sort of a downplaying of the social acts, the social relationships, and the commitment of hard work and care to children, and that being downplayed as opposed to biological links being more emphasized, as though that is what makes real parenthood. So what we really should be pushing for and striving towards is a re-emphasis, a cultural rethinking about what makes parenthood and what is actually parenthood, taking account of much more explicitly about the care and time in bringing up children. And I think in doing so, if we actually allow that complexity to be in the frame, then I think the issue around donorhood can also become a more complex one. We saw in an event that PET was running on the 16th of September that I was part of, for example, of Natasha Fox speaking of that she was really happy, she was really proud of the single parent family she'd grown up in. She didn't know the donor was, and she was perfectly able to hold the fact that she was really proud of her family the way it was, whilst also wanting to know the donor. The donor is not necessarily a threat or an indication that something is wrong or something is missing. That I think it would be, what would be really good if would be culturally, if we could have an understanding of kinship and parenthood to be a really complex combination of things, and genetics might be one of those things in there, but actually there's an awful lot of other things in there that makes up relationships between parents and their children and between kin more largely. So I think the focus on donor anonymity isn't really the issue here. The issue here is having a much broader understanding of what makes relationships and what makes relationships work and positive, and allowing them to be complex and have these different facets of genetics as well as social, the commitment of time and care and hard work, as all of that is kind of makes various kinds of connections, and they don't necessarily threaten each other.